Hello everyone, this is the sixth module of the Digital Holographic Microscopy workshop by the University of Memphis. My name is Carlos Trujillo. I'm from Universidad EAFIT in Medellin, Colombia. And in this module, we're going to talk about learning-based approaches to DHM. So in this module, we'll cover three learning objectives. First, we will recognize the stages in DHM in which we can use learning-based model to process data. Secondly, we want to learn the fundamentals of the most basic models to process data according to this paradigm. That is, we will cover convolutional neural networks and how we can use them to detect phase objects in raw holograms. And finally, we're going to appropriate the basic of deep learning models to process data in an end-to-end fashion, that is, to map information for raw holograms to undistorted phase map. Initially, I would like to talk about why we do DHM. Well, mainly because the possibility to image biological specimens, which primarily aim is to improve the diagnosis of diseases, of different diseases, for instance, malaria and others, by inspecting the specimens without actually perturbing these biological species. We can use light to do this, considering that light in the visible spectrum does not affect their behavior, their chemistry, neither their physics. The overall procedure involves a hardware step and a software step, as you all are well aware. But what we are interested in right now is in the software part. That is, once we obtain the information from the instrument, well, what we are going to do with this data? We need to process this data. We have both the deterministic approaches, as we will see in previous modules, but we also have deep learning and learning-based methods in general to process this data. So ideally, learning-based approaches are going to be used for the pre-processing and post-processing of the information retrieved from these instruments. Okay, let's talk about deep learning models. Initially, we need to address convolutional neural networks, or CNN. CNNs are the core element of any deep learning approach. These models have been initially proposed at solving classification problems. That is, to decide, for instance, if in an image a given object is present or not. For instance, is there a car in an image or is not a car in an image? So the idea, ideally, was to preserve the spatial structure of the object. That is, to recognize somehow the relation between different parts of the object within the image. The idea and the reason why these approaches and this in particular structure of the network has been widely used and propelled the use of different learning-based methods is that they somehow allow us to remove the pre-processing stage from the machine learning overall approaches. I mean, usually when you code a machine learning algorithm, you will need somehow to pre-process the images that are input to a system. Then you can have the classification or regression model to do some given task. But with this kind of models, you can avoid this pre-processing method because the main features of the information that is present in the image are somehow gathered, abstracted from these layers. So, as I just mentioned, the main feature of these models is that they preserve the spatial structure of the data. That is, if we have an image, for example, these layers can somehow isolate or abstract the spatial details that are characteristic of the given object to be detected. And by doing this in a stage-by-stage fashion, the really useful information of the input set of images is really abstracted, is really somehow summarized. So, what's the structure of a CNN? Well, the CNNs are composed of three main modules: filters, sampling layers, and the perceptron last part. The filters are essentially convolutional layers. This is some structures that apply convolutional numerical convolutions over the input images or of the information preceding a given layer in a particular moment. The sampling layer, most usually max pooling layers, are the ones that somehow summarize the information in order to only highlight the details of the information in the preceding section. And the perceptor part, which is a regular classification model in a simple and most short and small models called perceptor that are used to easily classify activating a given neuron, or in regression, outputting in a single neuron a value, a numerical value. So the convolutional layers are composed of filters which produce feature maps. Each filter is related to a specific spatial detail or a specific feature of the image that is input to the model. So the idea is to look for that given feature by means of a convolution and to activate the neurons or the parts of the subsequent set of data in terms of whether or not this particular feature is detected or not. So once we understand what a CNN is and how it works, well, the question is, how can we use this model to avoid the reconstruction stage in DHM? Well, to do this, we tested this model on detecting and counting phase objects, that is transparent objects, in raw holograms. So what's the proposal? We input a lot of DHM images, in this case 500 images, to a model, and we train this model to detect whether or not in a given window of the whole DHM hologram a given specimen is present or not. To do this, as we can all see in the left part of the slide, we tested it, we used 3 convolutional network CNNs, and after that we use a regular perceptron with one flattened layer, one dropout layer at 50%. That is, we use a CNN for a binary classification problem. As a loss function, we use the traditional logarithmic loss function. And of course, we use as an optimizer, a well-suited optimizer for this kind of problem, for classification problem in images, that is the ARM-MS prop. So we only use 300 images in total. That is not many images if we consider that deep learning models are complex and need a lot of data to be adjusted. So we employ data augmentation techniques to go from a small data set to a larger data set. Once the model is properly trained, we tested and we validated its performance in the particular case of RPC samples. That is, we introduce samples of different quantities and in different conditions, red blood cells, and we tested whether or not the model is capable of detecting and determining the accurate position of each of these specimens. Well, by comparing with the traditional way of doing this, that is recording the hologram, reconstructing the hologram numerically, representing this information in phase, and then unwrapping this information. As you all must be aware, this is a very complex procedure. Well, we obtain a final tomographic image of the sample, and in that way, we visually detected the accurate, the actual position of each one of the specimens. We then inputted the whole image to the trained model, and the model yielded some prediction locations. After we do that, we measure a 97% of effectiveness of the method at detecting and counting also RBCs. Of course, we tested this at different density of samples, that is samples with low density of RBCs and samples with high densities of RBCs. While using CNNs to classify some sort of information within an image, well, it is also important to see how we can map information from a raw DHM hologram to its corresponding phase reconstruction. To do this, we need a more elaborate algorithm or model. In this case, we're going to introduce the concept of convolutional autoencoders. So what's the main idea behind these algorithms? Well, these algorithms are based on the strategic idea of encoding and decoding information. As we can see on the left bottom part of the slide, what we are doing in this model is to input an image in a convolutional autoencoder in which step by step, or in each stage, I would say, the information of the input image is processed, somehow abstracted, the main details. There is a medium part of the model in which the information is totally summarized, totally abstracted, and after that part, which will be the decoding part, the information is recovered again to yield or to obtain the final dimension, which must be the same as the input dimension of the image. By doing this, somehow the information of the input image is processed by diminishes its dimensionality in the first step, that is in the coding stage, and increasing its dimensionality again in the decoding part. So convolutional autoencoders has been widely used to restore image. That's the main idea, essentially to remove noise. Why? Consider that noise is not the most important part of the information that is present in an image, for instance, the speckled noise in DHM. Well, this information is somehow removed in the first stage of the autoencoder, that is in the decoding part. The decoding part does not save the information of the noise, but still save the information of the important details of the image. That's why remove noise such as speckle in images is one of the main applications of convolutional autoencoders. Nevertheless, convolutional autoencoders has been also used in different applications such as image coloring, for instance. So to take advantage of this very important characteristic of the convolutional autoencoders of transforming information in an end-to-end fashion, well, we propose the following problem. The problem is the following. If we have a raw DHM hologram, how can we obtain, without any procedure, neither spatial filtering, phase compensation method, all the other procedures that we already know are always present when reconstructing DHM holograms? Well, the idea is how can we train one of these end-to-end models to receive information of a DHM raw hologram and to produce reconstructing phase images without distorted information, without any nonsense. So we propose that we can train a convolutional autoencoder to make this transformation, but the idea was first to obtain a robust reconstruction and compensation phase algorithm first, but also to produce a way to reconstruct this information in a faster way. Okay, how do we train this convolutional autoencoder for this particular problem? Well, to do this, in a traditional DHM setup, as we can see on the left side of this slide, we produce a large dataset. In this case, we produce 24,000 instances of images in which each one of these input images are the raw DHM holograms. And by using a traditional deterministic way of reconstructing all of them, we obtain their corresponding compensated phase images. This is the actual dataset that was used and that has to be used when training this kind of models. The structure of the trained convolutional autoencoder can be seen in this slide. As we can see, the encoder is composed of 3 convolutional stages. In each one, there is a convolutional layer and, of course, a max-pooling layer. 3 stages of these type of layers for the encoder, and of course, with the same parameters, but in an opposite way, of course, we implemented the decoder part. In between these 2 stages, we have the latent vector, which is somehow biased by a flattened network preceding the latent layer, and a fully connected layer after the latent layer. We employ 30 epochs to converge the model using the validations dataset as a metric to quantify the performance of the model. In here, we can see some of the results, and we see that although the convolutional method yields to images with some high spatial frequency noise in the edges of the specimens, we can see also that the background of the images by the convolutional autoencoder method is essentially homogeneous, which is expected, and we already know that this is the actual background that we need to have. And we can see that although the traditional method yields to some very good reconstructions, at the same time, the instabilities due to the experimental condition of during the acquisition can yield to some errors, as we can see in the enclosed region by the green lines. On the right of this slide, we see the topographic image, and we see that the proposed method always yields to shapes that are more accurate than those that are achieved by the traditional method. Okay, in this slide we can see the results by testing the performance of the method, the video rate performance of the method. We see that this is a video of the holograms acquired. We see in the second video that by using the traditional method, we can reconstruct this specimen that is moving, but we see a lot of different instabilities in the phase information that is provided. Nevertheless, in the video that is produced by the proposed method, by the convolutional autoencoder method, we see that although there are some, again, high spatial frequencies as noise, we can somehow have a homogeneous background, and all the specimens are always properly reconstructed. Well, although the results with the convolutional autoencoder are better than those that can be obtained by the traditional method in experimental conditions, we already wanted to test these deep learning models a little bit further. And in this case, we tested a generative adversarial neural network, a GAN model. Okay, first, an introduction to this kind of models. This kind of models is composed in all of the different modalities. It's composed of 2 systems. The first system is a generator model, and the second system is a discriminator model. The main idea is to train the generator to produce signals that confuse the discriminator. What do I mean by confuse? The idea is that the discriminator cannot discern between generated signals and signals that actually comes from the actual data set. So that's the main idea. It is a competitive training because we need to train the generator to generate image, but we also need to train the discriminator to do not fall in between do not fail at discriminating between real examples and generated examples of the signals. These models has been used in different applications, essentially for end-to-end models for image-to-image translation. So this means, well, a lot of different problems can be solved by using the GANs, and have been used to solve different problems with GANs. One of the problems is image super resolution. GANs are very well known by very good possibilities to reproduce images with high resolution. Also to change the scene, the same scene, but in different environmental conditions, for instance, daytime to nighttime photograms, but also in the possibility to generate fully generation of data sets. In this case, for instance, the faces, the GANs are the state of the art in this. Okay, what can we use? What can we do with GANs then in DHM? I mean, well, we thought that we could maybe improve the performance of the convolutional autoencoder. I mean, it is a more complex system. It requires, yeah, probably more data, but at the same time, it is somehow more accurate to high spatial frequency details, which is precisely the setback of convolutional autoencoders. So, well, what is the proposal then? We are using, or we are thinking exactly in the same problem, that is to map raw DHM holograms to compensate the face images, and using a similar data set of this kind of samples that we use in DHM, we train a convolutional generative adversarial network. For our particular network, we are using a conditional GAN, that is a GAN that not only produces signals, or in this case images, no matter the input, but in this case the input to the generator must be somehow related to the output of the generator. So the generated images are somehow related and mapped directly with an input, a given input. That's primarily, that's essentially the first distinguishable characteristic of these conditional GANs. Okay, in our model, the generator is a typical unit model, and in the discriminator is a typical binary classification matrix based on the CNN model. In the advantages, in this case, is that the adversarial loss is composed of two loss functions, two logarithmic loss functions. A long function that is trying to decide whether or not the generator image to the discriminator is a fake or not, or is true or not. And the second function of the loss model is a function that can give us somehow a measurement of the quality of the generated image. So it is not only about fooling the discriminator, but also to produce a high quality generated image. So the datasets to train this model is, as I mentioned in the previous slide, is essentially the same that we used for the convolutional autoencoder, but in this case, we didn't need all the complete dataset. We use a smaller dataset. One of the most important features of the GANs models is that the convergence criteria is not well defined. I mean, we will need some sort of alternative external way of determining whether or not our model is good enough for us. So, well, in our case, we understand the physics behind the DHM reconstructions, so we know what to expect. For instance, we know that when a reconstruction is well compensated, we don't expect a lot of phase jumps due to the unwrapping procedure. I mean, if an image is not properly compensated, we will see a lot of fringes that is the result of a tilting angle, of a non-telecentric scheme. Different sources of this kind of noise are probably the reason. So if we have a properly compensated image, its background and overall the number of phase jumps must be limited. That's why we use a customized metric, in this case a metric that accounts for the number of phase jumps in the resulting image. But also we tested the standard deviation. The standard deviation is related to the noise. So if we have a good high quality images, the noise must be the lower. Okay, here we have some results. Now, comparison between the results with the CGAN and with the results with the reference method, that is the traditional method. And we see that the CGAN no matter the experimental condition in which the DHM holograms are recorded, the CGAN always yields a stable, well-compensated images of the specimens. When comparing with traditional method, we see that although the traditional method can yield some very impressive, of course, reconstructions, at the same time, it can also yield to very non-compensated or very badly compensated images, as the one that we see in the second and the third row. Well, in this case, we see that the information of the shape of the specimen is properly reconstructed with the reference method, of course, but if the condition, the experimental condition, as I mentioned earlier, are not exactly the are not exactly those that yield to a proper reconstruction, well, the reference method fails. Nevertheless, no matter what is the experimental condition, also for the shape, also for the refractive index measurement, or we can say for the optical thickness measurement, we always obtain what we understand is a proper reconstruction of the specimen in this case, that is red blood cells with a donut shape, which is what is expected for this kind of cells. Okay, finally, we are testing the video rate performance. And yeah, although the CGAN requires a lot of time to be trained, as with any other deep learning method, but in particular, this method requires a lot of time. Once it is properly trained, it allows us to reproduce images 6 to 7 times faster than we can do with the traditional method. So this means that I'm gonna play the video. We have that with the conventional method, we have some instabilities and of course 9 frames per second. We see that these instabilities are not present. I'm gonna put it again. These instabilities are not present in the are not present in the reconstruction, and we can obtain the reconstruction almost 7 times faster. All right, what about the software? Yeah, we can implement all these models in Python. These models are complex, we already know this, but if we want to make a rapid implementation and we want to test something, well, we can use some libraries like Keras, TensorFlow, NumPy, OpenCV, all of Python libraries that are open access. We can just use them. There is a very large community behind these languages and behind these libraries. This is I would say usually the first way to be introduced in this kind of coding, and of course there is a lot of support in the internet and different platforms around this library. Well, the hardware requirements, in this case we need powerful machines. If we want to train CGAN, for instance, we will need a lot of time, and well, regular machines are not going to be able to achieve the training times that we are expecting, that is to train images of 1,000 per 1,000 pixels, for instance, and 1 megabyte of images. We will probably going to be able to do that with a regular laptop, for instance. So we need something powerful, that is true. But the good news about this is that several resources around the world, institutions providing resources, hardware resources around the world, and also we can buy some space or share resources on different platforms throughout the internet. Module, as summarizing, or in terms of summarizing, we recognize the stages of DHM in which the learning-based method can be used. Of course, we learn the fundamentals, an overview, a superficial overview, of course, of the fundamentals of convolutional neural networks and how we can use this model in the end-to-end fashion. And of course, we also understand the fundamentals of some more complex end-to-end models, such as generative adversarial networks, and how we can use it to process phase information from DHM holograms. And finally, to end this module, we would like to acknowledge our collaborators from different parts around the world: Colombia, Belgium, Spain, within the US and other parts, the different institutions that founded our work, and of course, our teams in our different research groups. Thank you. See you in the next one.